So I spend a lot of time talking about books. And when I'm breaking books down, I kind of break them down into categories. I talk about the plot, the writing style, the characters. And when we talk fantasy and sci fi, we're talking about world building. The worlds that our fantasy stories take place in play a big role in the stories that we're reading, more so than other fiction. So I wanted to dive into my favorite and the best fantasy worlds. So there's a few things I had to consider. We had to consider when these worlds were created, how original they were, how much of an impact they had on the genre, how just out of this world and mind blowingly creative the world was, how absurd and how far this world just takes us out of our own world. Then we don't just have to go for purely creativity, we can go for certain series that took previously established ideas and just put some really fun twists on them to further elevate the stories and the worlds that our writer is playing in. And there might be some worlds that are very similar to our own, but because the author is able to create such a sense of realness, I might have included it on this list. So we've got 8 worlds we're going to dive into today. One that is just the unquestionable number one world in fantasy. 5 worlds that I would argue should be on any top 10 fantasy world list. And then my 2 personal favorites, one of which I would be fine with if no one included it in a top 10. One of them I would argue could be number 2 of all time. So with that, right before we dive into these worlds, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and comment down below your top 5 favorite fantasy worlds that you'd love to be in, immersed in, be part of. It doesn't have to be a world you want to live in, because some of these worlds are pretty grim, but what worlds that authors brought alive for you that you just want to immerse yourself in. Now, I've just realized a top 8 list is kind of silly when I could easily just put in 2 more series. So here's one that, of course, the world building is incredible and it should be on this list, but I don't really like talking about it too much nowadays because I fell off and I don't plan on finishing this series. And that's The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Of course, this world is massive, expansive. There's tons of different cultures. There's different types of magics. There's different types of mythical beasts. It's one of the most well thought out worlds you're going to have. So I'll give The Wheel of Time its props there, but not spend too much time on it. I dropped off halfway through the 7th book in this series just because I felt like the story wasn't really going anywhere. Our characters were broken up across the globe, and we'd spend a lot of time with one group of characters where we'd spend a whole day with one person in a town, then we'd just go to their friend and spend a whole day with them in that town. And it's not like we're going day to day to day. It feels like we're just replaying the same day over and over and not getting anywhere. And I was just wanting to put this in like 3.5x speed on an audiobook and fall asleep. Like I wasn't invested in the story anymore, which I'm really disappointed with because I know everyone talks so much about books 11 through 14 being some of the best fantasy books ever written. And I can see why these first 3 books and the 4th book were really fun read. It's that mix between classic fantasy and Stormlight where you get a slow story fed to you throughout the book, and then just a big, massive ending with a big battle where everything comes together. So it was probably the series that inspired Sanderson to create the whole Sanderlanche sort of thing, because that was the Sanderlanche before Sanderson. It was what inspired him, and that's why he finished off the books. So big props for Robert Jordan and his world in The Wheel of Time. Then another one that I kind of forget about that I really enjoyed is the Witcher books, because I read all these before I really dove into reading. This was a series I read over about 6 months before I picked up the Bloodsworn saga and became someone that just reads every single day. And the reason I would include this on a list is because you just get everything in this universe. You get humans, elves, dwarves, gnomes, vampires, dragons, a ton of different monsters, and it all fits together nicely. So you just get a ton of everything. So I think The Witcher is definitely a fun fantasy world that should be checked out a bit. I don't know if this is the best series I ever read. I wasn't as focused of a reader when I read these books. I really did like the writing style and how much of the story just happens in the dialogue, and you just pay attention to what the characters are saying, and that there's no filler text in between the sentences, which I really appreciate, and I wish more authors did. And whenever another author does it, I really appreciate it. So diving into the top 8, we will start with the unrivaled GOAT. It's of course Lord of the Rings. This isn't the series that started it all, but it's the one we're all familiar with that started it all, if you know what I mean. Yes, Tolkien was inspired by the people, but what he did here was something special. And there is so many channels dedicated to purely talking about this one world that I couldn't give Tolkien justice at all. But I think we can all agree, whether you watch this or read this for the first time, This was something special, either on the big screen or on the page. You just felt immersed and you immediately just wanted to run off to New Zealand and try to find elves and dwarves. It's a fantastic world that just created so many fantastic, great classic world building elements that I constantly look for in other book series that I want to read. I love reading about dragons, elves, and dwarves, and so many of that traces back to this series. It's the unrivaled GOAT, and I don't know if there's anyone that would disagree with that. Then one of my most recent favorites that I don't think belongs on this list of all these other worlds, but I wanted to include it because it feels really alive to me, is the world of the Realm of the Elderlings. I only just started reading Farseer last month. I've literally just started Royal Assassin, but this is a series that feels like coming home. This world just feels very alive because we're so connected to the characters, and it feels like a very similar world to our own, with just a few little bits of magic added in. But because of Robin Hobb's writing style, I just feel immersed into it. So I wanted to give that one a little shout out, but that's all I'll say on Realm of the Elderlings. Now, diving into what will be a lot of people's number 2 world after the Middle Earth is the Cosmere. And I think world building is one of Brandon Sanderson's strongest points. I think plot and world building is where Brandon absolutely shines. He loves to create worlds that are very much not like our own. In Mistborn, we're literally inserted into a world where ash is constantly raining from the sky, and by consuming metals, you get certain powers. I was immediately immersed into that book from page 1 and just felt like I was somewhere else. And then one of his most ambitious worlds is the lands of Roshar, where massive storms ravage the land. So everything is built around being able to survive these massive storms. So you don't get plants like these ones behind me because a storm would just rip that out of the ground. So everything is very hard and the earth is very hard. All the buildings are built facing a certain way to fight against the storm winds. All the plants curl up into shells so they can protect themselves when the storms come. It's just so out there, so wild, so creative. And obviously the highlight of Brandon's worlds is his magic systems, his hard magics. So all of the magics he has have rules, and he's known for popularizing hard magic systems. He didn't create them, but he popularized them in books. And he's played such a big role in how people read fantasy now. Some people I know need a hard magic system in their books. Now they need their magic systems to have rules to make things believable and for them to get invested in the series, where they just don't get that from soft magic systems. So we can't deny the impact that Brandon has had on world building in fantasy. I think Mistborn is my favorite world of his, though Stormlight is the most out there, most creative world of his, along with the world that he shows off in his Sunlit Man novel. But Roshar just being a land ravaged by storms where you can bond with these spirits to get certain powers. Pretty cool, pretty out there. If you're talking world building, you have to talk Sanderson's impact on it. One series I've highlighted a lot on this channel is the Empire of the Vampire series by Jay Kristoff. But quite often when I talk about this, I'm telling you guys about the characters and the writing style, which I think are phenomenal. And I never talk enough about the world building. So let's rectify that wrong. In Empire of the Vampire, we're living in a world where at some point something happened with the gods, with the church, and the sun stops shining so bright. So now vampires are able to walk around 24/7. So they take over the land, and that's how we get the Empire of the Vampire. Now our vampires originate from 4 main bloodlines, and those 4 bloodlines each get a certain different ability. So some vampires can control animals, some are really strong, some can get in people's heads. So he just takes the regular vampires and adds a little bit of a twist to them to make them more intriguing. We also have a sect of religious warriors that are all half vampires themselves. So they get some of those vampires' abilities, but they're also human with a twist on it. And they're humanity's best chance to fight back against this Empire of the Vampires. Again, it's just small twists on things we're already familiar with that make it so immersive. And this is just such a dark world that is elevated both by the story and the writing style, but also just by the elements of world building Jay Kristoff's throwing in. We get a species of people that can turn into different animals, which is super interesting. And we get to dive further into that in book 2. And Jay does a really good job of showing what a world would be like when the sun doesn't really show for a significant amount of time. You know, regular plants, regular crops aren't going to grow. certain things are going to happen to the lands, and Jay does a great job showing that off in this book, in this series, and that's just one of the many reasons why I love the Empire of the Vampire and recommend it so often. Now, a series I just recently read that I really enjoyed being in the world of was the Five Warrior Angels series. Now, this one I wouldn't put at the top of my list, but there's a few elements of it that I really wanted to highlight. So, I love classic world building with small twists on it. So, we've got an elf-like species here, we've got an Urgle-like species here, but there's just been a few changes to them to make them more interesting. So, the elves in this series are called Varley. They're not as noble or as pure or as good as regular elves. They're quite devious, they're quite deceptive, and the Urgles, the orcs in this book, they have some vampire-like abilities, I'll say that. And we get to spend some more time with a member of their race, which is really interesting and something that I haven't read much in fantasy. Then some of the other species added to this one that I haven't read much of before. We just get a big evil saber-toothed tiger. Pretty damn cool. We get mermaids or merfolk that are just really evil and super intriguing in this book. And we get a League of Assassins that feeds their horses this sap from a certain tree, and it basically gives those horses steroid-like effects. They get red eyes, they get super jacked, and they're just like super horses. One more thing I forgot to mention is one of the main characters gets addicted to elvish nosebeers and has too much of a good time. When have you ever seen that in fantasy? And when you combine all these world building elements with Brian's really descriptive writing style, it just creates for such an immersive, dark world that is one of my favorites I've spent time in since I started reading. So, switching from one of the darkest series I've recently read to one of the lightest, more fun series I've recently read is the Discworld. Terry Pratchett's absurdist fantasy series full of satire and social commentary and wit. His world just includes everything. It's if you haven't heard of the concept of Discworld, it's a turtle flying through space with 4 elephants on its back carrying a Discworld. And you basically get every sort of fairy tale / mythical creature in this world. So we get humans, dwarves, gremlins, dragons, just anything you can think of. Terry's put it in there. And every book just feels like a fairy tale that has some sort of message, some sort of thing that Terry wants to get across, that's done in a really compelling story that feels so real, but at the same time, just super absurd, super funny. The amount of social commentary that Terry can fit into this world with how whimsical it feels it just doesn't make sense how good of a writer Terry was to combine so many of those things in one. And for that reason, I had to include Discworld on this list. And the next series I want to discuss is one of the most full-on worlds I've ever immersed myself in. I've only read 2 books of it so far, so I can't talk about it in as much detail as I wish I could. And that's the Malazan world. So from the 2 books I've read so far, I've been in 3 distinct continents. They each feel like their own environment, their own world. The magic systems in Malazan are super full on. There's a lot to them. There's a lot to take in. The different types of races and species included in this series are too broad to remember them all, as this is just such a massive, epic, sprawling series. But let's just talk about book 1 for a second. In book 1, we literally have a floating city that we call a moon. And the people that live on this city are from a race that can turn into dragons. They're really tall. I think they have crimson black skin, silver hair, and our main guy that we follow from this world just has a massive sword in his back and can turn into a dragon. Instantly, that's all I need to know for this is going to be a cool series. But then you include the vast different cultures that we see across these continents. We get to see different landscapes, different magics. We get to see a magic system where people are literally turning themselves into gods. There's things that they call warrens, where you can both access tons of magic, but then also travel through different spaces. I need to return to this series so I can tell you more about the world, but all the Malazan fans out there are going to tell you this is a top 2 world out there along with Middle Earth. I'm assuming they might go with another series. Even though I've only read 2 books of this series, I can tell it's the world building is top tier. So then the last series I wanted to talk about, you can tell it's sitting down here. It's my personal favorite series, and a large part of what makes it my favorite series is this is the most alive world in my head. When I think of Westeros, when I think of A Song of Ice and Fire and this universe, it's the most alive universe in my head. I can picture the Shadowlands in Ashai. I can picture Sotheros and the huge expansive jungles that just go on and on and on. And all these things that are just hinted at throughout George's books that mostly take place in a world like medieval England. But he just hints at so many extra things that the world feels so alive. I distinctly remember in one of the later books where one of our characters is just traveling down a river in Essos, where I was just so entranced in what that character was seeing and experiencing. I just realized from that scene on that this is a world I'll never be able to get enough of. And anytime George puts something out, I'm going to back it. And I am not a George hater because those books are all I need to enjoy the series. I don't need the ending. I would appreciate and love the ending. Of course, I'm going to read it. But that world just feels more alive to me than any others. And you got dragons, ticks off a list. You got a massive wall that's just there that no one knows why. You've got ice demons, the children of the forest that used to occupy all of Westeros, and how they're deeply connected to the land and through the trees. There's so many things I could dive into in Westeros that I love. I spent so much time just diving through different people's analyses of this world on YouTube videos when I first discovered the Game of Thrones TV series, and then reading the books. I absolutely love it, and that's why for me it's number one. But I can easily see why it's not number one for lots of other people. So I'm not saying it's a universal number one. I still think that's got to be Lord of the Rings. Though if you want to put Malazan or Sanderson as your number one, I completely see what you're going for, and I completely agree with you there too. They're two fantastic authors that have done really special things to their worlds. And if you have something that's not one of those three, what would you put on the list? Would you put it as Westeros? Would you put it as the Wheel of Time universe? What worlds am I completely forgetting out about? Please let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.